It all started on an ordinary Saturday morning, the kind where sunlight pours over quiet cul-de-sacs and the air smells faintly of fresh-cut grass and weekend calm. The neighborhood of Maplewood Ridge was the kind of place where everything looked identical. White fences, beige houses, and driveways polished to perfection. It was the kind of suburban symmetry that the Homeowners Association, or HOA, prided itself on maintaining. Every house followed the same approved palette of colors: cream, sand, and light gray. Nothing too bold, nothing too personal. And for years, no one questioned it. Until one man did. Ethan Moore had lived in Maplewood Ridge for 6 years. He was a quiet, middle-aged man who worked from home as a graphic designer. His house was like every other in the neighborhood: beige, plain, and utterly forgettable. But when his wife, Claire, passed away after a long illness, Ethan found himself surrounded by a world that felt drained of color, both inside and out. One morning, after months of quiet grief, he stood outside his home and decided something had to change. He didn't plan to start a rebellion. He just wanted a bit of brightness back in his life. So he chose a soft, ocean blue paint. Nothing garish, nothing shocking. Just a calm, welcoming shade that reminded him of family vacations and laughter on the coast. It took him 2 weekends to finish. When he stepped back to see the result, he smiled for the first time in months. The house looked alive. It looked hopeful. It looked different. By Monday, that difference had become the talk of the entire neighborhood. Some whispered compliments behind curtains, others frowned in disapproval. But it was only a matter of time before the HOA noticed. 3 days later, an envelope appeared in Ethan's mailbox. Inside was a neatly folded letter printed on official stationery, with the HOA's golden logo at the top. It stated in cold, mechanical phrasing that his home violated Section 14B of the Community Appearance Guidelines. The blue color, they said, was non-compliant with the approved aesthetic standard. He was to repaint his home to an approved color within 10 business days, or face a fine of $500 per week until compliance was achieved. Ethan read the letter twice, disbelief tightening in his chest. He wasn't angry yet, just confused. Surely this was some mistake. He had seen homes in neighboring communities painted in all sorts of colors. What harm could a soft blue do? But as he learned more about the HOA's leadership, it became clear that the rule wasn't flexible, especially not under the watchful eye of the HOA president, Linda Calloway. Linda was a perfectionist in every sense. Her own beige house looked like something out of a catalog, and she made it her personal mission to ensure that Maplewood Ridge never strayed from its uniform charm. To her, Ethan's blue house wasn't just a breach of guidelines. It was a personal challenge to her authority. Within a week, Ethan received another notice. Then another. The fines started adding up, and the tone of each letter grew more aggressive. He was accused of disrupting community harmony and negatively impacting property values. Each phrase felt like an attack on something that wasn't just his home, but his healing. Neighbors began to whisper. Some avoided him entirely, afraid to get on Linda's bad side. Others quietly offered sympathy, but admitted they couldn't risk speaking out. Maplewood Ridge wasn't a neighborhood that welcomed rebellion. But something interesting started to happen. The longer Ethan refused to repaint, the more people began to notice the absurdity of it all. Children loved the blue house. They called it the happy home. Visitors slowed down when passing by, admiring the soft color against the endless row of beige. Even a few neighbors secretly admitted that it brightened the entire street. Still, the HOA persisted. Eventually, Linda escalated matters by calling an emergency HOA board meeting. Flyers were placed in every mailbox, declaring a special session regarding color compliance violations. It was scheduled for the following Thursday evening in the community clubhouse. The tone of the notice was unmistakable, a public shaming. Ethan didn't plan to attend at first, but as the day drew closer, something inside him hardened. He realized this wasn't just about paint. It was about control and the right to make his home his own. So he showed up, wearing his paint-stained jeans and an old flannel shirt, while Linda stood at the front of the room in her perfectly ironed beige blouse. As she lectured the crowd about community standards and visual cohesion, Ethan stood quietly at the back, listening. Her words dripped with authority, but her expression was tight, defensive. And for the first time, Ethan noticed that not everyone in the audience was nodding in agreement. Some were rolling their eyes. Others exchanged looks that said what no one dared to speak aloud. This had gone too far. When the meeting ended, the room buzzed with murmurs. Ethan walked home slowly, the sound of gravel crunching under his boots. He looked up at his blue house, glowing softly under the streetlight. It didn't feel like a violation. It felt like freedom. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet act of defiance was about to spark something far bigger than a paint dispute. Because by the next morning, one of his neighbors, an older man who lived 3 houses down, was standing in his driveway, holding a paint sample card that matched Ethan's exact shade of blue. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, and that's how it began. By the following weekend, Maplewood Ridge began to change in ways no one could have predicted. What had started as a silent act of defiance, one blue house against a sea of beige, slowly began to ripple through the neighborhood like a quiet revolution. The first to follow was Mr. Jenkins, the retired history teacher who lived 3 doors down. His house was modest, the kind of place that always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. For years, he'd muttered under his breath about the HOA's absurdity, but never dared to act. When he saw Ethan's house glowing under the morning sun, it reminded him of the seaside town he'd grown up in. So, one Friday morning, he went to the local hardware store, bought the exact same shade of ocean blue, and by evening his house matched Ethan's perfectly. No announcement, no words, just quiet solidarity. Over the next few days, more houses joined in. First 1, then 3, then 5. Some neighbors didn't even bother asking permission or explaining themselves. They simply started painting. Pale blue walls began appearing across Maplewood Ridge, spreading like a calm wave. By the time the weekend was over, the once monotone neighborhood looked like a watercolor painting, soft, cheerful, and alive. The HOA board was thrown into chaos. Linda Calloway, the president, spent her mornings marching up and down the streets, clutching her clipboard, taking photographs of every blue house in sight. She sent warnings, fines, and threats to homeowners, citing the same section of the bylaws that had been used against Ethan. But this time, something was different. The sheer number of violators overwhelmed her system. She couldn't keep up with the paperwork. The board's email inbox overflowed with messages, some angry, some mocking, others simply refusing to comply. Homeowners began quoting Ethan's case in their replies, pointing out inconsistencies in the enforcement of rules. The HOA's power, once absolute, was beginning to crack. Behind closed doors, the rebellion became a movement. Families who'd never spoken before now gathered in driveways, swapping paint cans and tips about brushes and rollers. Teenagers volunteered to help elderly residents repaint. Someone created a neighborhood group chat named Blue Ridge Rising. Within days, nearly every household was in it, except, of course, Linda and her small circle of loyal board members. For the first time in years, Maplewood Ridge felt like a community. Ethan watched all of this unfold with quiet amazement. He hadn't planned any of it, but as more and more houses turned blue, he realized people were painting not just for aesthetics, but for meaning. It was a statement, a rejection of control, and a celebration of individuality in a place that had long punished it. By midweek, over half the houses had been painted. The sight was breathtaking. Where once there had been rows of lifeless beige, now stood a landscape of ocean hues, soft blues, pastel teals, and gentle grays. Even those who hadn't joined in yet admitted it looked better than ever before. But Linda was furious. At an emergency HOA meeting, she raised her voice to the point of shouting, demanding that all non-approved homes be repainted immediately. But her words no longer carried the same weight. The board members, once loyal to her authority, were uneasy. They'd seen the shift too. They'd watched their neighbors come together, watched the mood of the community lift. One even dared to ask if maybe, just maybe, it was time to review the outdated color policy. Linda's glare silenced him instantly, but the seed of doubt had been planted. By the next morning, Linda decided to make an example out of Ethan. She hired contractors to come to his house unannounced with an order to repaint it back to beige, claiming emergency board authority. But when the workers arrived, they were met by a wall of neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder across the driveway. Men, women, children, even the Jenkins family's golden retriever, sitting right at the front. No one shouted. No one moved. They simply stood there, calm and resolute. The contractors hesitated, sensing the tension, and quietly backed away. Linda's plan had failed before it even began. That night, word of the standoff spread across social media. Someone had filmed it, and the video quickly gained attention under the title, HOA Tries to Repaint Home. Neighbors Unite in Protest. Comments flooded in from viewers all over the country, praising the unity and mocking the HOA's rigidness. For the first time, Maplewood Ridge was trending online, and not in the way Linda had hoped. As the attention grew, so did the movement. Houses that hadn't yet joined began painting, inspired by the story. The HOA fine stopped making sense. How could they possibly fine an entire neighborhood? The rule had become unenforceable. But Linda wasn't done yet. She began preparing her final weapon, a legal notice threatening collective action, claiming that every non-compliant homeowner could face liens or even property seizure. It was an empty threat, but few residents understood the legalities well enough to challenge it. That was when Ethan decided he had to act. He reached out to a local news outlet that had covered similar HOA disputes in the past. A reporter agreed to visit the neighborhood and document what was happening. By the end of the week, a camera crew arrived at Maplewood Ridge. Neighbors gathered around, sharing their stories on record, how they were fined for harmless changes, how they felt suffocated by arbitrary rules, and how painting their homes blue had brought them closer together than years of HOA community events ever had. The reporter promised to air the segment that weekend. As the sun set that evening, Ethan stood at the end of his driveway, watching the golden light dance across rows of blue houses. What had once been a symbol of isolation had turned into a symbol of unity. The street that once felt controlled now felt alive. But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over yet. Because when power begins to crumble, those who cling to it fight the hardest. And Linda Calloway was not the type to go down quietly. By the time the local news segment aired, Maplewood Ridge had already become a small-town legend. The story of the blue neighborhood spread quickly, shared on social media, and picked up by larger outlets. Overnight, Ethan became an unintentional symbol of suburban resistance. The footage showed smiling residents standing in front of their blue-painted homes, laughing, grilling food, and waving to the camera. The segment painted them as ordinary people tired of overreach, a neighborhood taking back its freedom. For the first time, the public saw the HOA not as protectors of order, but as the villains of conformity. Linda Calloway, however, saw humiliation. Her name wasn't mentioned directly in the report, but everyone knew who the HOA president was. Her phone didn't stop ringing. Angry board members, irritated lawyers, even distant relatives calling to ask what was going on. She had built her reputation on perfection and control, and now her neighborhood was the laughingstock of the entire county. That night, she sat alone in her kitchen, flipping through the HOA bylaws, searching for any loophole or clause she could weaponize. Her manicured finger traced line after line until she stopped at one particular paragraph, a clause that allowed the HOA to issue retroactive penalties for repeated noncompliance, causing collective devaluation. It was vague, subjective, and rarely used, but it was something. The next morning, letters were delivered to every blue-painted house. Each one carried a stern notice of collective fines totaling thousands of dollars. Linda believed that fear would scatter them, though when faced with real financial pain, the rebellion would collapse. But she underestimated what had been built. Instead of dividing them, her actions unified them even more. The group chat exploded with messages. Within hours, neighbors gathered in Ethan's driveway again, holding copies of the letters. Some were angry, others anxious, but all determined. Ethan, calm as ever, reminded them that no one could legally enforce a rule that was inconsistently applied. They decided to contact a lawyer as a group. A week later, attorney Susan Hendricks, a sharp, fearless woman known for handling HOA abuse cases, arrived in the neighborhood. She walked through Maplewood Ridge with a notebook in hand, observing, taking notes, speaking with homeowners. When she finished, she smiled slightly and said that Linda had overstepped her legal authority. The bylaws, she explained, could not be applied selectively or punitively without due process. In short, Linda's threats were illegal. That knowledge spread through the community like wildfire. Fear was replaced with confidence. People who had once hidden behind curtains now greeted Linda openly, no longer intimidated by her clipboard or her lectures. The balance of power had shifted, but Linda refused to surrender. At the next HOA board meeting, she tried to hold her ground. Her voice trembled with forced authority as she accused the residents of destroying the neighborhood's integrity. Yet the turnout that night was unlike anything before. Nearly every homeowner attended, filling the room wall to wall. And this time, they didn't sit quietly. They spoke. One by one, residents stood up, calm, firm, and united. They talked about how the HOA had gone from protector to dictator. They described how the blue color had brought back life and friendliness, how the neighborhood finally felt like home again. Even one of Linda's former supporters admitted the community had never looked better. Linda's face turned pale. She realized, in that moment, that she had already lost. Within a week, the board voted for a leadership re-election. For the first time in years, Linda Calloway was no longer president. And as she packed her things from the HOA office, the sound of hammers and laughter echoed through the streets. Another family painting their home blue. But while Linda's reign had ended, her bitterness hadn't. She wasn't done trying to make her point, and her final act of spite would come sooner than anyone expected. A month after Linda's removal, Maplewood Ridge was thriving. The tension that once hung over the neighborhood had dissolved into laughter and casual barbecues. The new HOA board, led by a younger, fair-minded couple, promised to revise the outdated rules and restore trust. For the first time, the community truly felt like one. But Linda's shadow still lingered. One chilly morning, residents awoke to the sound of machinery. A city inspection crew had arrived at the entrance of Maplewood Ridge, claiming they were there to verify building compliance after a report of unapproved structural changes. No one knew where the report had come from, but everyone suspected. It was Linda's last attempt to regain control through chaos. The inspectors walked through the streets, taking pictures, making notes, clearly uncomfortable with the absurdity of inspecting paint colors. The new HOA president met them and explained that the color issue had been resolved democratically. The inspectors quickly realized they'd been sent on a pointless errand and left after filing a single line in their report. No violations found of municipal code. That was the final blow. Word spread that Linda had filed the complaint anonymously, and the embarrassment was complete. She quietly sold her home a few weeks later and moved away, leaving behind the same beige walls she had defended so fiercely. After her departure, the neighborhood embraced its new identity fully. The color blue became symbolic, not just of rebellion, but of unity, healing, and hope. New families moving in were welcomed with open arms, free to paint their homes however they wished. The HOA's new motto, written proudly in its revised charter, read, "A community isn't built on uniformity, but on understanding." Months later, as summer arrived, the neighborhood held a small celebration. Children ran through sprinklers, neighbors grilled food, and every porch light shimmered softly against the blue-painted walls. The evening breeze carried laughter down the street, the same street that had once been silent under the weight of rules. Ethan stood quietly at the edge of his driveway, watching the scene. His house, the first blue one, looked exactly as it had the day he finished painting it. He thought of Claire, how she used to tell him that color could change the way you feel about the world. He finally understood what she meant. He smiled, knowing she would have loved this sight, a whole community reborn through color and courage. And as the sun set over Maplewood Ridge, The blue houses glowed like calm waves under the fading light, each one carrying the same message. No rule can suppress the spirit of a home, because sometimes all it takes to change a community is one coat of paint.